Hi everyone, and welcome to this video. So today we're going to be doing something that I haven't been doing on this channel. We're going to be talking about JavaScript. So I'm going to build a simple REST API using ExpressJS, which is a framework that allows you to build web applications with JavaScript. ExpressJS is a framework that is so similar to how you may see Flask or Fast API, as in it doesn't give you a specific way of doing whatever you need to do. So it is a fast and opinionated minimalistic framework for Node.js. I'm also going to be using Sequelize, which is basically an ORM that helps you to build Node.js applications, and it acts as an ORM. It helps you to be able to write classes, to be able to describe the database schema of your database. So without further ado, let us get into the video. So right here in my VS Code, I have a blank VS Code folder right here, which I called Express to do. Feel free to call whatever you may want. I have Insomnia, which I'm going to be using as the testing client for our small application. I also have XAMPP, which is going to provide for me the MySQL server. The database I'm using is MySQL, but feel free to choose the database you may want. So the first thing we're going to do is to try to set up an environment we're going to code our application in. So the way we do that is by initializing npm. npm is the node package manager, and all it does is to help you manage and install dependencies that you may need for your project. So I'm going to begin by pulling up my terminal. I'm using git bash, but feel free to use your cmd or any other terminal. So the first thing I'm going to do is to check whether I had Node installed. Now I'm going to leave the links down in the description for how you may install Node and npm. However, if you're on Windows, when you install Node, you are having higher chances of having npm installed. So when I say npm, I basically have npm installed, and I'll be able to see a lot of commands, but I don't know why it's kind of taking a lot of time on my computer. But when you have npm installed, then you can be able to install the dependencies for applications. So when you say npm, we basically see all the commands that come with npm, access, add user. But what we are basically interested in is npm init, which is going to allow us to initialize a new Node.js project or a new JavaScript project in this case. So what I'm going to do is to Ctrl L to clear my terminal, and I'll initialize our project with npm init, and then I'm going to press Y. I'm going to give the Y flag because we do not want to fill in everything, and by saying -y, it's basically going to fill in the details for us. So when I press enter, this is basically going to create some very nice way of defining our project. So right here we see a certain file has been created within our project, and that is called a package.json file. Now this package.json file is a special file that npm creates for us, and it allows us to manage the dependencies as well as how we're going to run different commands about our application. This may be similar to your requirements.txt file, but it's different in a way that it also contains other things as regards to your application. So the first thing we shall see is our name. You can feel free to change this, the version of our project, which is version 1. Description, so we can basically put in a sample description. For example, this is our first ExpressJS app. And once we are done with this, so the main is basically the main file or the root of our project, which is index.js, but you can feel free to have any file. We have scripts. Now this is a very important part, as scripts is basically where I write the different commands that you may want to run for our application. Now we have one that is called npm test. Actually, the way we do this is by saying npm run test, and then this will go ahead and basically run test. Feel free to comment down in the description for better explanations. Now what I'm going to do is to basically create a file in which I'm going to code our simple application. So I'm going to call this file index.js, and it will be the main file. So I'm just going to come and say touch index.js. So this will be index.js. However, I can also create the file usually like how you create it, because I'm in Bash. That's why I'm creating it with touch. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is to go ahead and install Express. Now, the instructions are all on the website, and I'm actually going to leave everything down in the description so that you can check it out for yourself. So the command for installing Express is npm install express, and then we also have the save flag. And the save option helps us to basically save this as our dependency for our project, and it will also be added to our package.json file. So let us go ahead and install this. So I'll paste this command in here and press enter. So this will go ahead and install our ExpressJS, and then we shall continue building a simple web server and building API endpoints with this tool. Now that our ExpressJS has been installed, let us go ahead and see what has happened to our project. So what we have here is a node modules folder, and within our node modules folder is where every dependency of our project is going to be kept. Now think of this as a virtual environment in Python, but it's not like a virtual environment, because actually it's like a virtual environment because all the packages are installed within our virtual environment. But this is a folder that basically keeps all our project dependencies, and we also have a package.json.log that is basically necessary for keeping track of all the dependencies of our application. Now let me close this. Now the first thing we're going to do is to start building our simple web server. So what I'm going to do is to go to our index.js, and what I'm going to do is to start by importing our ExpressJS. So I'm going to create a constant, and this is going to be a variable, which is going to be, I'm actually going to call this express, and this is going to be importing our express, so we shall be able to access everything about express within this variable called express. So I'll do that by requiring express. I'll say const express is going to be require, then we shall require express. Now what this is going to do is to store everything we shall need about ExpressJS library within the app, within the express variable. And after doing that, then we're going to create a simple app instance that's going to allow us to create our server. So the way I'm going to do that is by saying const app, and in this case it's going to be equal to express. Now once we've done this, we shall be able to access everything about our app within this simple app variable. Now we're going to go ahead and basically start our server. Now the way we start our server is by basically listening on a certain port. So we're going to just come and say app.listen, and in this case we shall basically specify where we want our app to listen, or the port on which we want our app to run. So I'll just basically create another constant here, and this constant is going to be the port. So we're going to specify that our port is going to be port 3000. Now I'll just come right here, and all I have to do is to specify that we're going to run on port 3000, and then we shall provide a callback function that will run after our app has listened on this specific port. So the way I'm going to do that is by creating an arrow function. Now I'll go ahead and create a JavaScript course so that you guys can be able to understand JavaScript, and me also. So the way we're going to do that is just basically console logging. So I'll just come and say console.log. This is similar to the print function, and all it's going to do is to just print out so in this case we may want to just show that our server is running on the port. So shall just say server is, let me actually use these strings, and I'm actually going to use this template retro strings, and what I'm going to do is to say server is running at, now I'm going to specify the URL, which is going to be localhost, and in this case I'll just basically use the syntax so that we'll be able to write, to replace or write the format string in here. Now this will be our port, and this is just enough for our server to start. Now, just like I explained, our package.json file is very important, as it's going to help us dictate the way to run our app. So the way I'm going to do that is by coming to our package.json file, and within our scripts right here, I'm going to add one command, and that is going to be a start command. Now what this start command is going to do is going to dictate how we're going to run our app. Now when we have our start, I'm going to specify the command that's going to allow us to run our app. So in this case, we can just say node, and then node is the nodejs runtime, and here we're going to specify the file that you're going to run, which is going to be index.js. Now I'm going to save this, and once I save this, I'm going to go to my terminal. I'm going to first clear it, and I'll come and say npm start. So this is basically going to go ahead and run our server. And right now we see that our server is running at localhost 3000, which is beautiful. So now let's go ahead and try to create our first API endpoint. So the way we create our API endpoint is, so I'm going to go to our nodejs or our index.js folder. It's actually a file. And what I have to do is to basically create app, then we shall have to call the specific HTTP method. Now this is very similar to how Flask and Fast API work nowadays, and in this case you'll have to call the method. So in this case, let's just call a simple get method. We specify the URL, and this is going to be our root URL. You can decide to call it whatever you want, and then a callback function. So this callback function takes in the request as well as the response. Now the request is how you basically making your request, and the response basically how is the server going to return your response. So we're going to basically provide this. So you may choose to write this as full statements, for example request and then response, or you can choose to keep it short. So what I'm going to do is to just keep it to request and then response, and then this is going to be an arrow function. So what you want to do is to basically return a simple JSON response, and the way we're going to do that is by using our response object right here. So I'm just going to come and say response dot. So in this case, you can call the different methods right here, just like you see. Now I'm going to call the response dot status, which is basically going to help us return a status code, and in this case I'll return a status code of 200. Now if I want to return any kind of data, I may return the data. So let's say I may just return response.json. I may also say response.send, which is going to basically send any type of response, but in our case we want to return JSON, so I'll just return response.json. So right after doing this, I'm going to save. Now if you're noticing here, we have to restart our server, so I'll have to press Ctrl+C and then say npm start. So this will run our server localhost 3000. So I'm going to go to our testing tool Insomnia, and all I have to do is to create a simple request collection, and I'm just going to call this express to do. And once I have this, I'll create a simple HTTP request. Now this is going to be what we're going to provide our URL. So we can decide to name our request. Now this is going to be hello world. We haven't actually specified our response. Now I'm going to provide the URL here, which is going to be our localhost 3000. And since it's on our root URL, I'm not going to provide the URL. So what I have to do is to go right in here and specify the JSON that we may want to return. Now I'm simply going to create an object here, and I'll provide a message, and then I'll come and specify that we're going to say that this is going to be hello world. Now I'm going to save this. Now if you've noticed, there's one problem that we have here. The problem is every time I make changes to our index file, we have to restart our server, or we have to stop the server and then restart it again. Now there's a specific package that allows us to run our server and reload in case we have file changes, and that is called nodemon. So I'm going to install nodemon and set it up so that when we make changes, our server is going to restart, so that you don't have to stop it and then restart it. So I'm going to press Ctrl+C, and then what I have to do is basically install nodemon. So I'll do that with npm install save, and in this case I'll just say nodemon. So this will go ahead and install nodemon. And after installing nodemon, now I'm going to go to our package.json file right here, and all I have to do is to change this from node to nodemon. So when I go ahead and save, when I say npm start, our server is going to run, and now we see that this will look for any changes. It will watch for any changes within our JS files and then reload our server, which is good. So now each time we make a change, so for example, when I save, in this case, we see that our server is restarting. Okay, let's go ahead and make our first request. So what I'm going to go and do is to go to our localhost 3000. When I make this request, we now see our response is being returned, and our response is hello world. Yes, so we've been able to make our first API request with Node and Express. So now we're going to be building a very simple CRUD API. The next thing we're going to do is to set up our API endpoints so that you'll be able to do the CRUD functionality. So what I'm going to do is to go ahead and create a router which is going to separate our logic for our CRUD from our index.js file. So the way I'm going to do that is by coming right here. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this routes.js. And this JavaScript file is going to contain whatever routes that we shall have for our application. Now inside here, I'm going to first create an express variable. So this is going to allow us to access all functions within ExpressJS. And I'm just going to come and say const express is going to be equal to express. Actually, it's going to require express. And once we are done with this, I'm going to go ahead and create a router. And this router is basically an instance from which we can be able to create our routes. So the way I'm going to do that is by creating a variable which I'm going to call router. So this router variable is going to be express.router. And once I've created this instance, I'm going to go ahead and create the various endpoints, so the various URL on our simple to do API. So the way I'm going to do that is by coming right here and saying app dot, in this case it's actually going to be app, so shall call get. Now the way we write our URLs, so we're going to start with the one for returning all our to-dos. So I'm just going to come here and say app.get to-dos. Then we're going to do the same thing like we did. We're going to write basically a callback function that has a request and a response as the params. So in this case, shall have request and then response, and then this is going to basically return all our to-dos. So I'm going to do the same thing for all the other routes. So I'm just going to come and copy this. So that is for getting. This will be for posting. So we're just going to come and say app.post. And then we shall have one for getting to do by its ID. So I'm just going to come here and say app.get, and this will be /todos. Then I'm just going to come and provide a parameter. So this is going to be a path parameter that's going to allow us to access to do by the ID. And then we do that with Express is by specifying it like colon, and then we shall just provide the ID of that specific to do. Now we're going to do the same thing for updating. So just going to come here and basically set up the one for updating. Now this will be put. So just going to come and say app.put. However, if you're using a patch request, you can also do the same thing, app.patch. Now I'm also going to write the one for deleting. I'll just come and say app.delete, and this will be the same thing. I actually forgot. I'll just copy, paste it, and then say app.delete. And one mistake I've actually done here is all these are supposed to be on the router, not the app, because we don't have an app instance. Now I'm going to basically use Ctrl-D to remove this, and then we shall have all our routes on the router. Now the next thing we need to do is to make our main application file be able to know that we have these routes. Now I'm going to export our router so that we'll be able to access it within our index.js file and register it and register all our routes on a specific URL. So let's do that. So I'll just come right here at the bottom of our code, and all I have to do is to say module.exports, and then I'm going to equal this to our router instance so that we can be able to access it within our index.js. I'm going to come within our routes, and then all I have to do is to just export our router. So we're going to access this within our index.js. So the one way to do that is by requiring it or importing it. So I'm just going to come and say const, and in this case we're going to basically call this our route. So I can basically say const, I'm just going to say API, let me just call this API routes, and this is going to be equal to require, and in this case we shall require our routes. So we can just basically say slash and then we access our routes. So this is basically requiring a file that's within the same folder as our index.js file. Alright, now that we have this, the next thing is to register our routes from our router into our application so that we can access them via a specific URL. So to do that, we're going to basically come and use this function. So I'm going to call the app.use method, and what this does is to basically help us to register things such as routers or add middleware and any other thing to our application. So I'm going to say app.use, and then the first thing I'll do is to specify a URL. So it's going to be on our API, and then I'm going to go ahead, and what I have to do is to basically register our API routes. So once we are done with this, now let us go ahead and try to test this. So every time we're going to make a request to our API routes, we are going to be using the /API URL. So the one we're going to do that is by coming to our routes. Now let's try to send a simple response. I'm just going to come and say response.json, and in this case we shall provide a message. So let us just provide a simple message, and this message is going to be let's say all to-dos for now. When I save, our server is restarting thanks to nodemon. So when you go ahead and make this request, I'm going to go to Insomnia. So it's going to be our first get request. So just going to say get all to-dos, enter. So I'll just go to our local host 3000/API/to-dos, and when I send, in this case we see that's returning a message of all to-dos. So at this point we've been able to register our API endpoints to our main application. Now the next thing we're going to do is to set up a database so that we can be able to persist as well as be able to query for all our to-dos. Now this is where Sequelize comes in. Sequelize allows us to basically create a way we can write JavaScript to describe how our database is going to be. Now I have MySQL right here. It's running. I'm going to start the MySQL service. So I'll say start. I'm also going to start the Apache service, and I'm going to use phpMyAdmin to create for us a simple database. So I'm going to go to my browser. I'm using Chrome right here, and I'm going to go to my local host. I won't have to specify any port, and this will take me to the XAMPP dashboard. Now on the XAMPP dashboard, I'll go to the phpMyAdmin. I'm going to make sure I leave a link to this in the description as well so that you can check it out. So I want to access the phpMyAdmin, but it's taking some time. Alright, so right here is my phpMyAdmin. So I'm just going to create a very simple MySQL database, and I'm going to give this a name of Express Tasks. So call it whatever you want, and I'll go ahead and create this So our database has been created. We don't have any tables yet. So the next thing we're going to do is to set up our database, connect to it, and be able to create a model that's going to define our database schema using Sequelize. Alright, so let us go ahead and connect to our database. So the first thing we're going to do is to go ahead and install our Sequelize. So I'm going to go within our project folder, and what I have to first do is to install our Sequelize with npm install Sequelize. So this is going to be Sequelize, and then we are going to save this. So I'm just going to pass in the save flag. So this will go ahead and install our Sequelize. Now that our Sequelize has been installed, let us go ahead and set it up so that we connect to our database. I'm going to first create a file right here, and I'm going to call this our db.js. Feel free to call it whatever you want. Now then, our db.js, we're going to begin by importing our Sequelize class. Now what this class is going to help us to do is to create a connection object, and this connection object will be the one to help us connect to our database. So I'm going to begin by creating a const, and I'm just going to basically require, in this case we're going to require Sequelize. Now the Sequelize class is going to be from Sequelize, so just come and say we're going to import our Sequelize. And right after creating our Sequelize, actually importing our Sequelize, we're going to go ahead and create an instance of Sequelize that we shall use to connect to our database. So the way I'm going to do that is by coming right here, and I'm just going to come and say const Sequelize, and this is going to be equal to a new Sequelize object or instance, call it whatever you want. Now here we're going to provide a bunch of options. So in this case we're going to first provide our database we need to connect to, and let's go back to our PHP myadmin and see the database we created. So our database is Express Tasks. I'm going to head over here and basically say it's going to be Express Tasks, or whatever you called your database. Now the next thing we shall have to provide are going to be the username and the password. So in this case we're going to come and provide our username, and we're also going to come and provide our password. Now actually this username is going to be root, so I have a root user. That root user doesn't have a password, but you need to have a password for your application. So since they don't have a password, they have a plain text string or a plain empty text as a password. Now go ahead and provide our options. So in other options are going to be the dialect. So the dialect basically specifies the type of database we are connecting to, and in this case we are connecting to MySQL or MySQL, whatever you want to call it. So another thing we shall have to define is going to be the host, and in this case our host is going to be localhost since our database is running on our local MySQL server. So in this case I'll just come and say localhost. Now that we've created a connection object, let us go ahead and use it to connect to MySQL. So the way we're going to do that is I'm going to create a simple asynchronous function, and when you call this function we're going to be able to access our MySQL. So I'm just going to come here and say const connect, and in this case we're going to call it connect to, let's just call it connect to DB, and this function is going to be an asynchronous function. So we're going to say async, and what this is going to do is basically going to connect to our database. So we're going to write a try catch statement here. So a try catch statement will have a try and catch. This is similar to try and except in Python. So here we shall have catch, and then we shall catch an error. So we shall try to connect to our database using our connection object. So I'm just going to try to await, since it's also an async function. So we're going to call Sequelize dot, in this case we're going to call the authenticate method, and what this is going to help us do is to connect to MySQL. So in case we've connected successfully, we're going to just basically console.log So we shall just say successfully connected to our database. And right after doing that, then let's also catch some errors. So in case we have an error, we shall just console log that error. So I'll just come and say console.log, and then I specify that we're going to console log the error. So now that we've done this, let us go ahead and export these two things. We're going to export our Sequelize object because it will help us to create models. We're going to also export our connect to database function here. So I'm just going to come and say, in this case, we're exporting two things. So shall just basically say module dot exports, and this is going to be equal to an object. Now this is going to have Sequelize as well as our export, such as going to be connect to DB. So I'm going to basically save these. And once I save, now let us go ahead and connect to our database. So we need this to run on our server starting. Now I'm going to basically go ahead and require this in our index.js. So I'll just come right here and say const. I'll just say db, and in this case we shall basically go ahead and require this. So we can actually also say that we're going to require them like this. So I'll just come and say it's going to be require, then we shall call the file. So in this case it's going to be our db. So let us go ahead and access this. So we're going to require our Sequelize object. We're also going to require our connect to db function, and this is so far so good. Now what do we need to do? We need to actually connect to our database. Now the way we're going to connect to that database is by calling the connect db function, and we're going to call it asynchronously. So what I'm going to do is to change this callback function right here, and I'll basically make it asynchronous. And another thing I'm going to do is to also call the function after starting our server. Now the way I'm going to do that is by coming and saying await, and here we shall just say connect to db. All right, so let us try to save and try to run this. So when I save, our server is actually restarting because we are using Sequelize. Now we have an error right here. So what this error is telling us that we do not have the required database driver to run our application. Now MySQL uses the MySQL 2 package to help us access MySQL with Node.js. So I'm going to go ahead and stop our server and install our MySQL 2 package. So I'll do that with npm install, and in this case we shall install MySQL 2, and then we also save it. So this is going to go ahead and install MySQL 2, and we shall connect to our database. Alright, so now that our MySQL 2 has been installed, let us go ahead and connect to our database. So I'm going to go here and press Ctrl L. So this will actually clear our terminal, and then I'll start our server with npm start. Now you see that our server has been started, and now we also see that our database has been connected to. So we've been able to connect to our simple database we've created. Now let us go ahead and create a model that's going to allow us to create database tables in which we shall persist our data. Alright, so let's begin by creating a models.js file. So this is going to be a file. I'm going to click here and we're going to create a new file. So I'm going to call this file models.js, and within the models.js file we're going to describe a simple database model. So I'm going to pull down my terminal. So the first thing we shall have to do is to get access to our Sequelize object or instance. So I'll just come and say const, and then we shall basically require it. So just come and say require And right here, I'm going to require our db.js because that's where our Sequelize object was created. So I'll just come and import it, and once I've got access to it, now we're going to use it to create our model. So the way we do that is by just calling a simple method called a define method, and what this does is to basically help us to create a model. Now the first thing we shall have to describe is the model name, and in this case we're going to call this the tasks. Actually, it's going to be a task since it's a database model. It will just have a singular name, and then we are going to go ahead and describe the different fields this model is going to have. Now this is going to be an object, and it's going to have each of the fields described as an object. Now let us first describe the first field. So the first field we're going to describe is going to be our content, and the content of each of our tasks is going to be a field. So we're going to describe the various attributes that a field is going to have. Now the first attribute is always going to be the data type of that specific model field. So in this case, I'm going to access a certain class that has all these data types already described, and that is the data types class. So I'll have to import that from Sequelize. So I'm just going to come and say const, in this case shall say data types, or let me actually be sure of what I'm importing. So I'll just come and say require, and then I'll say Sequelize. And right after I've done that, I can just come and say here that we're going to import our data types class. So once you have data types, now we're going to go ahead and describe. So the first argument is going to always be the type or the data type of that specific model field. And in this case, we shall have our data types. So this is going to be a string. Now you can go ahead and basically describe other things such as unique constraints, or let's say you want it to have a max length, or you want it to have anything like validation. So let's say you wanted to validate this, we may come and say it's going to be an object and to have a max. So let's say the max length of each of the content should be, let's say, 150, and then we can describe another field. So let us go ahead and say that we're going to have our field, and let's say this field is going to be our, so I'm going to basically call this our description of that specific task. So in this case, we're going to call this our description, and description will also be a field, so it will be of type, and in this case we shall just say data types dot. Now let's say we wanted to describe this as text, and we may also do some validations or leave them out. And let's say we also want a boolean to show that each task is complete, so I'll just come and say is complete. And here we shall have an object. This object is actually going to be a type. It's going to have the type, and here we shall just come and say data types dot boolean. And yeah, this is basically a simple field. Now we also have some timestamps, or basically fields that are added for the date we created a certain object or a certain database entry and stuff like that, as we're going to see. Now this is just enough for us to describe a simple database model using Sequelize. Now the next thing we shall have to do is to go ahead and basically sync our database, or sync our model to our database. Now to do this, we are going to use our Sequelize to go ahead and create our model in the database. Now the way I'm going to do this is by coming right at the top here, and what I have to do is to call Sequelize dot. In this case, we shall just come and say sync, and this is going to take in the sync options. So once you have this method, we are basically going to sync or create the database using the model we've described. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and once I save this, I'm going to come and pull up our terminal. I'm going to go to the second bash terminal I created right here, and all I have to do is to run our models file, and by doing this we shall have our database created. So I'm just going to come and say node, and I'll call our models.js, and this will go ahead and basically create our tasks table within our MySQL database. Now right here we see that our database table is created using this SQL statement that we see down here. So let's go ahead and verify this with our phpMyAdmin. So I'm going to go to our web browser, so my Chrome right here. I'm going to go to our Express task database, and now we see that we have one table, which is the tasks table. When we go to our tasks table, we have it having all the fields that we've defined, such as the content, the description, and is complete. We also have created at and updated at. Now in this case, let's say we wanted to add some extra definition of our fields. I may just come right here. So let's say I wanted to describe our default for our is complete. The way we do that is just come here and say default value, and let's say our field is going to have a default value of false. Now I'm just going to come here and say node models.js, and this will go ahead and basically create that change within our database, and then we shall go ahead and build API endpoints to create, read, update, and delete our tasks. So when you go back right here, we see that our fields have been created. Now let us go ahead and use our ORM to basically create, read, update, and delete all our tasks. Alright, so I'm going to go back. So what you need to do is to go to our routes.js, where we actually have the various endpoints for doing all our CRUD functionality. So the first thing I will have to do is to first import our model. So they were going to import our model. So we basically defined one right here. So we defined one here. So actually I just called sequelize.define and defined the model, but I did not put it in a variable. So if I want to do that, I'll just have to come and say const. And in this case, I'll just come and call this our user class. And once you have this user, I'll just have to export it. Now I'm going to remove this line since it's only going to help us when we are creating our database tables. So I'm just going to save, and once I save, I'll first export our user model. So I'll do module.export, and in this case we're going to export our user model. So I'm going to go ahead and save. Now that I've saved, I'm going to go ahead and access that in our routes.js. So I'll just come and do that with const user, and in this case our user is going to be require. We shall access our models, so in this case it's going to be models. So let us go ahead and access all our tasks. Now what I'm going to do is to first query for all our tasks, and the way I'm going to do that is by just coming here, and what I have to do is to just come and call await. So we shall have to make our request handler function or our callback function an asynchronous function. Now that we have this, so we shall just come and say await user, then we call all methods. So we have all the methods that are available via our model class. So in this case we want to find all. This is one that's going to return all objects for that specific query, and in this case I'll just have to put this within a variable. So let's say const, and this is going to be tasks, and it's going to be equal to await user.find all. Now what we need is to return this within our JSON. So just going to come and say response dot status. So shall have to first specify the status which is going to be 200, and then we shall have to specify what we're going to return within the response body. So I'll just come and say .json, and we shall provide our tasks. Now that we have this, let's go ahead and save. And when I go back to my insomnia right here, we've been returning this simple message, and now we expect to return an empty list of tasks or to-dos. So when I send, we now see that this is returning an empty list of tasks. Now let us go ahead and create tasks. So the first thing I'm going to do is to get data that we may send via any client or any web app or a mobile app and stuff like that. And the way we're going to do this is by passing a request body to our API. So to do that, I'm going to begin by accessing those. So since we have our request object here, can give us access to our request body. Now let us create our data. So I'm just going to come and say const data is going to be equal to our request body. So we shall access that via request.body. And once we have this, now we're going to just simply return this in our response for demonstration. I'll just come and say response.status. Now the response status code we expect to return for creating an object is going to be 201. Now I'm just simply going to come and say .json, and we shall return whatever we shall basically send on our client. So let us go ahead and test this out. When you go right here, we are going to create a new request, and this new request is going to be for creating a task. So just come and say create a task. And once you have this, I'll just come and say that we're going to have a post request and shall have our URL as localhost. And this is going to be 3000/API/todos. And I'm just simply going to provide a body that's going to be JSON. And here I'll just have to provide, let's say, a name. And then let's say Jonah. When we send this, we now see that we have a 500 internal server error. And what this is doing is to actually tell us that request.body is not a function. I actually called it as a function, so I have to remove those parentheses. Let us try to call to basically make this request once again. So when I send, we now see that nobody is being returned for the response, and that's because we cannot be able to access our body as we send this. Now this is where the body parser comes in. Body parser is basically a package that will allow us to have middleware that's going to allow us to send JSON to our application. Now the way we're going to do that is by coming right to our index.js and adding it via app.use. So I'm going to stop our server, and what I'm going to do is to basically call our body parser. So install it with npm I, and then we are going to install body parser, and we shall also save it. So this will install body parser. And now that we've installed body parser, let's go ahead and basically enter it or register it or use it within our application. So I have to first import it. So I'll just say const body parser is going to be equal to require, and in this case we are going to require our body parser. And now once we have this, then we can go ahead and use it. So I'll just come and say app.use, and in this case we shall use our body parser. Alright, so once we have this, then we can go ahead and basically try to make the request once again. So when you go back to our API to-dos, I'll actually start our server with npm start. Now that our server has started, let us go ahead and try to send our request. So when I go back here and send, we see that we seem like we have an error still. And right now we see body parser is, let's actually see what this is telling us. Body parser is deprecated, so we can use individual JSON or URL encoded middlewares. So I think the way we need to solve this is by removing body parser. So let's try to remove this, and then what we can do is to basically use the JSON middleware that's provided with Express. So the way I'm going to do that is by saying app.use, and here we shall just come and say express.json, and I think this will be helping us. So when I save, our server is going to restart. Now let us go ahead and try to make the request once again. So I'm just going to come and send, and now we see that our body has been returned. Wow, this is good. All right, so let us go ahead and try to create a new task. So the way we're going to create a new task is by getting the data that we sent from our client, send it to our database, and then be able to store it. So the way we're going to do this is by coming right here, and then we're going to head over to our routes. So within our routes, we shall access whatever value that we shall get from our data. So we can use this very interesting destructuring syntax and then be able to get whatever we want to get out of the request. So I see the fields that we have. We have our models.js. We have the content, the description, and this complete. So what I can do is to go ahead and maybe access the content and the description, since we have a default value for our is complete attribute. So I'm just going to come here and say content, and then I'll also come and say description. And once you have this, then I'm just simply going to come, and all I have to do is to go ahead and maybe set up our database so that we'll be able to create a user using these credentials. So, actually say it creating a user. It's not creating a user. It's basically going ahead to save a task having these credentials. So to do that, I'm just going to come and create a new user or a new task. Sorry for that simple distraction. So what I was saying is, after getting the content from our client, the next thing is going to be to create a new task. So I'm just going to come and say new task, and this is going to be creating our task using the task class. What did we actually call it? When you go back to our models, we call this user, but it's supposed to actually be task. So I'm just going to come and access this, and shall have task. So sorry for that. So I'm just going to come and say task. And when I save this, I'm also going to change how we call it right this side in our routes.js. So I'm just going to come and use Ctrl D. So I'll highlight user and then say Ctrl D. Here I shall access task. So and now we are safe. So I'm going to go ahead and save this and go ahead. So in this case, we're going to create a new task. So let me put my headsets back on. So the way we're going to do this is by coming here, and I'll go ahead and basically await. Actually, I'm not going to await. What I have to do is to go ahead and basically use our task class to create a new user. So I'll use the .build method, and this is going to take in a record or an object with the various fields that we need to store. So in this case, I'll just come and say that we're going to build an object containing our content, and the content is going to actually be the content as we got it from our client. And then we're also going to create a description. So we're going to have a description, and that description is going to be the description as we got it from our client. All right, now that we've created our new task, let us go ahead and save this task to our database. So the way we're going to do that is by awaiting a method. So meaning that this will have to be an asynchronous callback function. And then I'm going to come and await new task. So since this is a task object, we shall just come and say .save. And that will save it to our database. And since we've saved it, we are going to basically return the new task as the response data. So what you can actually do is to just come here and use a try catch block. So I may just try to say try and then try to save the task. And in case you have any errors, we shall catch those errors. So I'm just going to come and say catch and then errors. And then I'll just basically return those errors as JSON. So I'll just say return, or basically return them as JSON with response.json, and then return the errors. So once we've done with that, so let us go ahead and try to create a new task. So Now go to our insomnia right here. We're going to create a new task. So in task is going to have content, and let us just call this our sample content. And then we shall also have a description, and let us go ahead and call this our sample description. So let us go ahead and save this in our database. So when I say send, in this case you see nobody is being returned for our response. Let's go ahead and see, because it did not return it. So I'm just going to come here and say we're going to return our new task. So when you go back, seems like this has been created. So let us go ahead and maybe call this sample content 2 and sample description 2. So when you send this, now see that our task has been created. So when you go to get all our to-dos, when you send, in this case you see that all our to-dos are being returned to us. Now this is working. So let us go ahead and also try to create other tasks. So I'm going to create a task. I'm going to call this learn JavaScript. And then I'm just going to come and say I will have 2 hours of learning JS. Now these are not complete, so that's why you see it's complete being false. So when I send, now see that these are actually working. So let's go ahead and try to create another task. So let me say edit a video. So I'm just going to come and say edit video, and in this case I'll say I will edit. So in this case I'll say I'll edit a video on ExpressJS. So when I send this, our task is going to be created. So when you try to get all to-dos, in this case you see that we now have 4 tasks or to-dos in our database. Good. So let us go ahead and try to get an individual task or to-do. Let me actually create this and call it get all to-dos. So I'm just going to come and say create a to-do. So now that we have this, let us go ahead and try to go ahead and access one task. So to do that, that's going to be simple. So what you shall have to do is to just come and say const task, and this is going to be equal to, so shall have to call an asynchronous method. So in this case, shall just come and say await, and what you shall have to do is to say task dot find. So in this case, since we are finding one, you can just come and say task dot find one, and in this case shall have to specify the options. So I'm just going to provide an object, and in this case we shall specify where in this case shall have to specify that specific field. So in this case where the ID is equal to, so shall have to access the request parameter, which is our ID. So to do that, we shall just come and say request dot param. Let's actually say request dot param. Actually it's going to be request dot param dot ID, which is our ID we provided as our request, or in our request. So once you have that, then let us go ahead and try to return this. So shall just come and say response dot status, which will be a status code of 200, and then .json. Then we shall provide our task. So okay, so let us try to access this. So I'll go to our insomnia right here, try to create a new request. So this will be get to do by ID, and then we shall create this with a URL of localhost, and in this case it will be 3000 and then /API/, so this will be /todos, which is going to be to do, and let's try to access that to do with an ID of 1. So when you provide that and you say send, now this is returning an error. Let us go ahead and try to find out. So when I go here, we're going to see that await is only valid in async functions. It seems like this is not an async function, or we forgot to basically async await. So let me try to fix that. So when you go back here and it says end, we now see that our to do has been returned. And now let's try to update. So for updating, we're going to need to get data from the server. We're also going to need to query for that specific task we need to update, and then go ahead and update it. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is to implement an endpoint for marking a task as complete. So before we use our put method right here, I'm going to write the same method, but it's going to be a patch method because it's going to update only one field, which is the is complete field. So I'm just going to come and change this, and I'll copy this. So route dot, so in this case we're going to have route dot patch, and what we shall have here, I'm going to first query for that specific task. So we already have that here. So I'm just going to copy this this specific expression, and once we have that, then we shall need to now go ahead and access the different data that we want to update. Now, since this is a patch method, what we want to update is a task's is complete status. So to do that, we shall access this. So I'm just going to come and say is complete, and this is going to be accessed via request dot, oh sorry for this, it's going to be request dot body. And once I have this, then I'm going to go ahead and update our task. So what you can do is to just come and say task dot, in this case this is actually supposed to be an asynchronous function, so I'm just going to come and say async, and then here we shall have to await, then it's actually await. So this is going to be task dot. In this case, what you can do is to update, so we can just say task dot is complete. So, and in this case you can set it to true, and once you have this, then what you can do is to go ahead and save, and we can just go ahead and say task. So I'm just going to go ahead and say await task dot save, so that we change our task in our database. So I'm just going to go ahead and say await task dot save. We call this method, and then after doing that, we shall just return our response. So I'm just going to come and say response dot JSON, or let's first specify the status. So we shall have our status as 200, and then specify the JSON, and the JSON in this case is going to be the task that we've updated. So let us go ahead and do this. So when I save, seems like we are having an error here. Await task dot is complete, or there are two methods to do this. So let me try the one of setting. So I can say await task dot set, and then we provide the object containing the specific field we want to update, and this field is complete. So shall have is complete, and then this will be true. Alright, so now that we have this, I'm going to go ahead and try this out. So when I save, let us go to our Insomnia. We'll create a new task, and this is going to be update to do status. So it's going to be update to do status, and once I have this, I'll also change the method from get to patch, and then we are going to have our localhost of, so this will be localhost of 3000, localhost port 3000, and then we shall access to do. So let us try to access to do /1, and it's actually going to be on the /API route. So /API/to-do/1, and once you have that, then you're going to go ahead and specify that our body is going to be JSON, and in this body we shall just come and say, actually this is going to be, since we are getting is complete from the request body, now we'll have to set this to true. So what you shall have to do is to just come and say is complete. Now the is complete we are getting is the one from the request body, so it will have to set this to true. So when you go here, we shall just come and say is complete, and here we shall specify that this is going to have a value of true. Alright, so let us try to see. We are going to set this to is complete, which is going to be true, meaning we can even turn one that is complete to false and stuff like that. So let us go ahead and try to send this request, and now we see that our task has been updated and now it's complete. Yeah, stuff is working right now. So let us go ahead and try to update the entire task using a put request. So the way I'm going to do that is by coming on our route.put, and we're going to go ahead and basically write the code for updating. Now this is going to be so similar to what we have here. I'm actually going to copy this entire code and paste it right here. Now I'm going to go ahead and try to update all the fields. So we have is complete, we have the content, we also have the description. Now these are all fields that you need to update. Now task.set, then you have to specify those. So we're going to specify content, which is going to be content, and then we are also going to specify the description, which will be equal to the description that comes from our client, and then we go ahead and save. So it will return the same status code as well as the task that has been updated. So I'm going to go ahead and save, hoping that our server is running, no errors. So we are having an error. We need to first set this callback function to be asynchronous, and then our server is running. So let us go ahead and try to update an entire task. So when you go back here, when you go back to our to do, so in this case I'm going to go create a new request, and this is going to be, let's say, update an entire task. So this is going to be update an entire task. So I'm actually spelling it wrongly, so this is going to be update entire task. So once we have this, then I'm going to change this request from get to put, and then I also provide the URL. So this is going to be localhost 3000 /API/ to-dos / maybe 1. So we shall provide our body, which is going to be JSON, and this JSON is going to have all fields that we use to create our task. I may even just try to get this and update an entire task with it. So I'll paste it in here. All we need is the content, the description, and is complete. So we're going to change this and then maybe remove this comma and try to make things a little bit. So our ID of 1 is having a task of sample content. Now let us change this to something like play basketball, and now we are going to change our sample description to, let's say, play some ball with the boys. Okay, so once we have this, then we can go ahead and maybe send, and this will update our entire task of ID 1. So in this case, you see that the task has been updated. Even when you try to get the ID of 1, we're going to see that our task has been updated. When we get all to-dos, we are going to see that our task has been updated. Now stuff is working. Yes. All right, so let's go ahead and try to delete to complete our CRUD functionality. So to delete this, we are going to need to go in our code right here on our delete route, and the first thing we shall have to do is, of course, get that specific task we want to delete. So I'm just going to come here and get this task, and once I get it, I'm going to paste it in here. So I just come and paste that right in here. So after I do that, now shall have to just await task.delete. Now since this is an asynchronous function, I have to change this and add async. And once I have that, then let us go ahead and try to to do this or to return a response. So since this is a delete request, we expect nobody to be returned with a request with a response. So shall have to just come and say response dot status, and in this case our status is going to be 204 no content, meaning we have been able to delete our task. So let us go ahead and try to delete a task. So when I go to our Insomnia right here, I'm going to create a new request, and this request is going to be one for deleting a task. So once we are done with this, I'm going to call it a delete request. So let us delete a task. So I'm going to say localhost 3000/API/to-do/1. And when you try to delete, we see that error returning receiving data from the peer. I don't know what's wrong, but let's try to see. So task.delete is not a function. Sorry for this. It's actually task.destroy. I'll leave a link to the description. I'll leave the link to the docs in the description. So this is going to be destroy. And when I save, hopefully it's going to work. So when I send, seems like we have a problem. Let us see. So the problem we are having, it's actually deleting. That is taking a lot of time. So let us try to see. So are we actually returning the response? I think. Let's try to return some JSON here. Run empty object. And when you try to run our server again, our server is now running. So let us try to delete that specific task. So we don't have any data for that specific. So cannot read properties of now, which means the task does not exist. But since the task does not exist, what we need to actually do is to return a 404 status code in case we don't have it. So we're going to create some error handler functions, and what these are going to do are going to help us to basically catch these errors, or basically return a response in case we have an error on the server side. So what I'm going to do is to go within our index.js, and all I have to do is to describe this function. So I'm going to use app.use before we describe any route. So I'm just going to come and say app.use. So we're going to basically create these functions that will be running before any other request, and they'll basically help us to catch any errors. So this is going to be a function, and it's going to be taking in the request as well as the response. And what we shall have here is we're basically going to return the response. So shall just come and say response dot, in this case, this is actually going to be request and response. Sorry for that. So it's going to return the response, and in this case the status will be 404 in case a task is not found, and then we shall return the appropriate data. So in this case, we shall just come and say response.json, then we shall return a message of, let's say, to do not found or resource not found. So let's just say resource not found. And once we're done with this, now I'll do the same thing for our 500 status code. So I'm going to just come and say app.use request response, and in this case it will be 500. And let's say in this case we're just going to return an error, and let's say oops, something went wrong, which is a server-side error. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to wrong. So what we have here is this request handler. So let us try to make a request once again. So we are not getting data from the peer. I don't know why this is happening. I need some help, if you can help me. So what's happening is, I think the task has been deleted. So let us try to confirm with our, let's actually try to confirm with getting all tasks. So get all to dos, we try to send. it seems like we can't connect to the server. Let us just try to restart our server. So we need to stop our server and then restart it with npm start. So let us try to send this request again, and now we see that our task has been deleted. So let's try to delete a task with ID of 2. So I'll try to delete a task once again, and this is going to be having an ID of 2. So when you send, we now see that the task has been deleted and no body is being returned for the response. So let us try to get a to-do by ID. So when you try to get a to-do, it's going to be response of null. So I wonder if we did the same thing. Feel free to correct me down in the description. But for now, we have our to-do routes implemented. So if you're good at JavaScript and you watched this video, please leave a comment down in the description about what we can do to better our API. I've really had fun building this simple API with Express, MySQL, and Sequelize. Thank you for watching, guys, and I hope to create more videos about JavaScript. See you in the next video. Bye.